24th, March 1945, Berlin airspace. German ready rooms had a running joke about America's red tails escorts with flashy paint and thin nerves. Today they expect the usual decoy/escorts peel bombers left naked at the gate. Then the contrails hold. The red rudders don't wander. A Mustang cuts the angle guns steady, and a jet falls smoking through cloud. The joke dies in the headset. The truth lands like shrapnel. What they mocked wasn't paint. It was doctrine, range, discipline, and endurance backed by factories. Underestimating that machine wasn't bravado. It was the last mistake many Luftwaffe veterans made. Summer 1943. Across occupied Europe, confidence wore a black cross. Luftwaffe squadrons claimed seniority in the trade, hardened leaders' tight formations, and a playbook tuned by years of combat, from Poland to the Channel and the Steppe. Their creed was elegant and cruel: hit the bombers at the edge, split. The box finish. The stragglers disappear before escorts can turn. The tools fit the creed: BF 109s, with climb FW 190s, with punishing roll rate radios, drilled to brevity controllers, vectoring fighters like chessmen from Freya and Würzburg. Propaganda reinforced the bias: Americans were soft, industrial, and impatient. Long-range escort was fantasy. Colored units were publicity, not killers. Early clashes seemed to confirm it. Escorts ran short on fuel. Bombers bled over Regensburg and Schweinfurt. Jet prototypes promised a war-ending trump card. In ready rooms, pilots traded lines about red-painted tails and easy tallies. They trusted the arithmetic of scarcity. Germany's pilots were craftsmen. America's were mass-produced. Why fear quantity when quality had always carried the day? The Axis status quo rested on three pillars: doctrine that presumed the escort would peel technology, optimized for short, violent intercepts, and a culture discipline breaks under pressure. The sky would soon argue otherwise. To the Luftwaffe veterans gathered in smoky ready rooms, from Linz to Vienna, America's new idea looked like a contradiction dressed up as a press release. A long-range escort built around the P-51 Mustang, standardized external drop tanks, and a rigid bomber escort discipline could not possibly hold together once metal met weather and weather met enemy. External tanks meant drag and indecision. You are sluggish when you need snap, and when you jettison to free the airframe, a patient foe can refuse the merge and leave you thirsty and foolish. The German intercept game was timed to seconds: climb under ground control vectors, roll into a high deflection, slash across the lead elements, extend, reset, repeat. Against that tempo, a Mustang arriving from Italy with cylinders hanging under its wings looked like a victim searching for a headline. They distrusted American pilots for reasons that sounded like hard wisdom, but were mostly habit and prejudice. The bait tactic had worked so often: throw a fast decoy wide and oblique, let escorts peel for scoreboard glory, then hit the bombers where the formation thins. Americans, they said, were energetic and impatient. They would always chase the tease. Add racist contempt for the red-painted tails flown by black Americans, dismissed as a publicity flourish, and the sneer hardened into certainty. Discipline in this telling always cracked when the sky filled with cannon flashes and the radio grew hot. They also read the Mustang's celebrated range as fragility. Any machine tuned for cruise economy must somewhere pay a price climb that wilts after 2 hard turns, roll, that hesitates at the snap, cooling that gets temperamental at sustained power armor that trades ounces for miles. Germany had learned to prize short-legged knives flung from fields close to the target. Everything about the American promise fighters crossing the Adriatic, meeting bombers over the Danube approaches, still fresh at Berlin's gate, felt like a paper bridge. A gust, a headwind, a late fuel truck, and the bridge would tear. Confidence in their radar-to-controller system added another layer. Freya and Würzburg fed calm voices who moved flights like chessmen. They believed deep escort units far from their own controllers, and drenched in bomber chatter, would always be a beat late. A beat late is the difference between a clean beam attack and a useless stern chase. Finally came the arithmetic that comforts a force low on fuel and men quality beats quantity. A handful of Experten in BF 109s and FW 190s, drilled in head-on passes and brake turns, should carve up mass-produced pilots who had never stared through a spinning hub at a formation that filled the world. The mockery lasted because it fit their past. It ended because the Americans changed the future. The P-51's laminar wing, the Merlin's high-altitude lungs, the routine of fueling and swapping tanks like clockwork. The brief that made restraint feel like aggression. Hold the box cut, the angle, ignore the bait added up to a geometry that did not blink. What looked like paint was identification. What looked like timidity was trap building. What looked like range was a weapon. By the time the laughter faltered on the interphone contrails were holding over the target, and cannon passes were meeting Mustangs that were somehow still there. The American air campaign bled at the same seam day after day deep inside the Reich, just as flak belts thinned, and the last 10 minutes to target began. Escorts were running out of sky. Bombers pushed on in tight boxes, while oxygen masks iced, and gunners watched their arcs like men peering through keyholes. Then, at the far edge, gray darts rose and slashed. Courage could not change the math. You cannot win a daylight precision strategy if you cannot arrive with teeth. From the Adriatic up the Po Valley across the Alps and the Danube toward Vienna, and the refineries that fed the war, the problem repeated. Timing drifted, fuel margins shrank, and the Luftwaffe chose the moment. The fix began with humility and a decision. Range would not be treated as a convenience. It would be the doctrine. Engineers wrung economy from the Merlin and cooling from the ductwork. Planners turned drop tanks from accessories into a supply chain. Crews learned cruise tables that converted minutes into certainty instead of hope. The P-51 brought the airframe. Logistics brought the fuel. Leadership wrote a single ruthless sentence across the brief, "The bombers come home." Everything bent to that line. No chases for pretty angles. No peels for decoys that looked fast and felt important. Spacing around the box was a perimeter to be maintained, not a crowd to escape. Italy mattered because it bent the map. Fields like Ramatelli put fighters under clearer weather, and shorter climbs arcing them into Austria and beyond, with fuel to spare. But geography without behavior is just scenery. The last link was human rotations that kept fresh elements at the vulnerable edges. Brevity that cut radio to essentials flight leads who treated the bomber stream like a living thing to be guarded rather than a backdrop for duels. Range made presence possible. Discipline made presence lethal. The seam closed a mission at a time. Over the refineries near Vienna, over marshalling yards that fed the eastern fronts, over the approaches to Berlin, where jets began to prowl. The last 10 minutes changed owners. Enemy controllers still vectored. Interceptors still came. Men still died, and no statistic erases that. But the structure of the fight shifted. The hunters found their passes shortened. Their exits blocked their second attacks denied by escorts that refused to vanish. What the enemy had counted on, fuel clocks expiring. Escorts dissolving into the distance, stopped happening. The solution was not a miracle part or a single heroic sortie. It was a system that arrived on time and refused to leave. A fighter that could cross the Adriatic and still sprint. A logistics train that treated drop tanks like ammunition. A unit that measured valor by how many engines rolled back over friendly concrete at dusk. In that system, the strategy finally breathed. In that breath, the war's air began to tip. The idea did not begin in a cockpit. It began where metal sings, in drafting rooms at Inglewood and Dallas, in the wind tunnels at Langley, in the hot, echoing galleries of Packard's plant on East Grand Boulevard, and in a low building at Rolls-Royce where someone said almost casually, "What if we put the Merlin in it?" The Mustang had been a clever airframe from the start. Clean lines, a wing that pushed drag down where it mattered, a radiator installation that turned waste heat into a whisper of thrust. But mid-war reality demanded something impolite, range that changed strategy and manners in the cockpit, that turned restraint into a weapon. Engineers chased that first requirement with an almost American rudeness. The Allison-powered Mustang was fast down low, a racer in a straight line, but it gasped where the war was actually being fought. The British had a habit of trying things without permission, and the moment a Merlin engine slid into the Mustang's nose, the airplane's character snapped into focus. High altitude stopped being a place to endure and became a place to hunt. Packard took Rolls-Royce's fine English lungs and built them like American appliances, interchangeable, predictable cereal. In the test cells, men in oil-blackened coveralls stared at needles and learned the engine's moods at every manifold pressure and every temperature the weather might throw. Meanwhile, North Americans' teams kept filing at the corners of drag. The wing built to keep laminar flow honest demanded precise skins and rivet lines straight as sermons. The radiator duct, inspired by a physicist's footnote, became an article of faith. If you shape it right, the heat you carry pays part of your bill. The canopy swelled into a bubble because heads up is worth a dozen knots you can't use. Everything edged toward a single thesis: arrive high, arrive fast, arrive with fuel left over. But the second requirement, what to do with all that arriving, wasn't born in a factory. It took shape in quiet rooms where the Red Tails leaders argued with custom. Fighter pilots are bred to chase. The brief said, don't. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. wore discipline like rank, and he did not bend words. The mission was not to decorate kill boards. It was to keep bombers alive at the minute when the Luftwaffe felt most certain. In practice, that meant cutting angles early instead of diving late. It meant spacing that looked too wide until an enemy tried to slip through and found geometry waiting. It meant letting a decoy streak by without a single Mustang flinching. Supply officers, usually invisible in stories about glory, became the other F of the experiment. Drop tanks are just cylinders until a depot treats them like ammunition. Railheads and truck convoys made sure the right mounts and the right fuel showed up where the weather said tomorrow's climb would be kindest. Ground crews at Ramatelli learned the ritual until it was music tanks on lines checked, guns loaded, paperwork, stamped prop pulled through, breathe prime fire. If any of that faltered, range turned back into rumor. Mid-war is the cruelest place to innovate. You do not get a clean slate. You get the middle of a sentence already being shouted. The team solved it by speaking in two dialects at once. In America, industrial grammar jigs gauges parts that knew where they belonged. In theater, operational poetry hand signals on a cold ramp, a leader's voice that made the air feel smaller, a set of rules so clear that breaking them felt like cowardice. When the first long escort profiles worked bombers rolling wheels on friendly concrete after raids that would have chewed them up a year earlier, the experiment stopped being risky and started being obvious. That is how good ideas look when they win inevitable in hindsight, impossible the day before. The last piece fell into place not in a lab, but in a headset. The radio net stripped itself to bone. No speeches, no novels. Position, threat, cut. The man who spoke least and earliest kept the sky alive. In that silence, the system clicked: an airframe that could go the distance, an engine that breathed thin and cold, a logistics chain that treated fuel like fate, and a unit that had decided quietly, stubbornly, that the most aggressive thing a fighter can do is refuse to leave. Strip the paint and the poetry away, and the secret is an arrangement of forces that cheats the air's meanness. Start with the wing. Most wings make peace with drag by brute strength. The Mustang's wing asked for precision. Instead, skin's flush contours exact, so that flow stayed smooth, longer friction stayed shy, and lift rode cleaner at the altitudes where bombers lived and fighters hunted. That calm in the air turned into minutes in the fuel ledger. Now the engine. A Merlin with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger is a promise kept at altitude. It does not run out of breath when contrails start to pencil the sky. It keeps pushing charge air into cylinders that want to work, and it does it without cooking itself to death, because the cooling system is an accomplice, not an afterthought. The radiator duct is more than a place to dump heat. Shaped correctly, it trades the energy of that heat for a nudge forward, the Meredith effect in practice. It is not free thrust in the comic book sense, but it trims the bill you pay for staying alive up high. Fuel is where theory becomes strategy. A pair of external tanks turns a fast, short-tempered fighter into a courier with choices. The trick is not just hanging the tanks. It's integrating them into procedure. You cruise on the externals under settings learned like multiplication tables. You keep the internals fat for the fight, and you jettison only when a fight actually exists. That restraint denies the enemy his timing. He wants you light and late. You arrive heavy and on schedule, then shed the dead weight when geometry demands it. Control is the quiet, invisible advantage. Many air arms taught their controllers to paint the fight with words. The red tails taught theirs to whisper and to do it early. When early isn't possible, doctrine fills the gap. Elements rotate through the vulnerable sectors without being told. A moving picket line that always seems to present a fresh set of eyes at the place where a beam attack might develop. Radios stay short because the map in every head is the same. Gunnery lives at the intersection of patience and math. The Mustang's speed tempts rash shots. Doctrine drags the reticle to where it hurts, cut-off angles that spoil an interceptor's pass, stern cover that forces an overshoot into a kill box, bursts at ranges where tracers are truth, not hope. Gun camera film tells you the rest, fewer long, wasteful sprays, more brief surgical slashes that end a problem or at least end its second pass. All of that is tactical excellence. The strategic edge appears when you stack it: airframe, engine, fuel, discipline, radio, grammar, gunnery priorities on top of a supply chain that does not flinch. Tanks and mounts arrive. Merlin parts fit without pleading. Tires, plugs, and ammo do not become drama. Reliability becomes a weapon because it compounds. One more mission flown this week means another yard bombed, another bridge, down another refinery that wakes up late and dies looking for fire crews. The Luftwaffe's defense plan depends on windows gaps when the escorts vanish and the hunters feast. The system's true genius is not that it kills more, it's that it erases those windows. The overlooked advantages are almost impolite in their simplicity. Visibility, the bubble canopy, keeps you from losing fights you never see. Energy retention, a clean airframe, means every dive buys more altitude on the way out. Pilot workload. Predictable handling and standardized checklists make average pilots good and good pilots relentless. None of this is glamorous. All of it is decisive. Why is it superior strategically? Because it shifts the currency of war from moments to minutes. The enemy bets on moments, ambushes, slashes, shocks. The system buys minutes over target on escort still there when the second wave tries its luck. Minutes are how factories burn, how yards split, how fronts starve. When the escorts stop disappearing, the defense stops hunting and starts surviving. Once survival is your mission, the war is already leaning away from you. That is the secret sauce, not a single miracle, but a stack of small, stubborn truths arranged to arrive on time and refuse to leave. 24. March 1945, Berlin airspace. The morning began in Italy with the ritual that made range into certainty. At Ramatelli, crew chiefs moved like a metronome. Tanks fitted lines, checked props, pulled through until each cylinder nodded. Pilots studied a route that arced up the Adriatic, cut a seam through Austria, then crossed into the cold, bright geometry above the Reich's capital. There was nothing theatrical in the briefing altitudes, turnpoints, radio brevity, the rule written like a commandment. Hold the bombers. The climb gathered them into a single long thought. Contrails wrote their signatures at 20,000 feet, then higher. P-51s with red rudders slid into stations beside silver boxes of B-17s and B-24s, the heavy ships that would find marshalling yards and rail bridges and bleed the city's war nerves. The first test was always patience. A pair of enemy scouts flashed distant and fast. No one peeled. Fuel stayed in the externals. Cruise settings held. The escorts were a perimeter, not a hunt. Over the Danube, the air turned glassy with cold. The radio voices shortened to bone call signs, bearings a clipped cut when a formation edge needed teeth. Far ahead, German controllers were doing what they had trained their whole lives to do: draw lines from radar plots to vectors, feed flights into the bomber stream like knives. The first slashes came at the box corners, BF-109s, trying to rip the lead sections apart. The red tails didn't chase. They moved like a hinge, a small rotation of elements that presented fresh eyes to each threat, turned the beam attack into a head-on problem, then forced the interceptors to blow through empty air. Past the target's initial approach, flak bargained for altitude in black flowers. The heavies held course. The escorts trimmed, checked, and breathed through the bone-deep instinct to dive after every gray wing that flashed. Then something new scratched the sky, a sound more felt than heard, a shape that looked sleeker than the age would allow. Jets. Me-262s rising from their nests to carve the stream with speed that mocked every propeller. The plan for jets had been argued over coffee and quiet anger. You do not outrun them, You outthink their energy, force them into bad geometry on the climb, on the turn, or crossing the bomber box where their speed steals their own time. A call came cold and early jets high 2 o'clock, and a section of Mustangs slid up like a door closing. One pilot eased the nose, holding a cut that looked too shallow until the jet's path intersected the invisible line he had drawn in his head. Bursts short and mean. Tracers folded into a wink of smoke, and the Me-262, so certain of its sprint, fell with a kind of disbelief, leaving a black rope in the blue. Another jet tried a stern slash, and found the escorts still there after the pass, as if the speed had not carried them away. That was the part that broke habits. The escorts were still there. The red tail's rotations didn't tire. The perimeter didn't collapse into a chase. Bombers rolled in on the target while the Mustangs cut and recut, tightening every angle where a pass might form. When the heavies turned for home, the escorts were not burning fumes and hope. They had fuel to fight the return leg and discipline to make the ambushes late. Gun camera film would later show what the headset voices remembered. Short bursts at honest ranges, no wild handwriting across the sky, no self-authored duels pulling a section away into nowhere. The jets that lived did so on a razor of luck and fuel. The 109s and 190s that tried to time their second pass found the wall already rebuilt. By the time the formation bent south for Italy, the lesson had been written in contrails. Not a single dramatic gesture, not a single hero's chase, but a system arriving, surviving, and refusing to leave. Men wiped oil from their cheeks on the ground and asked the same question in different words. How were the escorts still there? The answer was scattered across the mission, like brass casings, range procedures that kept the tanks when it mattered, a radiogrammer that kept thought from drowning in its own voice, and a unit culture that defined victory as aluminum wheels thumping friendly concrete at dusk. The first thing that broke was not a wing, it was a habit. German controllers watching plots creep across plotting boards had an old rhythm they could feel in their bones. Escorts thin near the target peel for decoys, arrive a fraction late to the second pass. Their timing was a craftsman's comfort measure, twice cut once, and it had held through years of attrition. On this day over Berlin, the timing slipped from their hands. Fighter leaders in the climb saw it sooner than the men with grease pencils. They rolled into the bomber stream expecting the usual choreography, hit the box corner, split the lead, clean up the stragglers, only to meet a geometry that moved like it had practiced the moment all night. Mustangs slid into the beam path before the slash could mature. A decoy streaked wide and no one chased. A second element went for the stern and found not open sky, but a lattice of escorts that seemed to replenish themselves with every turn. Pilots who lived by seconds began to feel something few had felt in years: delay. Delay in the merge. Delay in the reset. Delay in the chance for a second pass where cannon usually wrote the outcome. Each delay cost fuel. Each cost nerve. In cockpits where men had spent a career believing in individual brilliance, the realization came that the enemy had brought a system calm where you needed panic presence, where you counted on absence. The Me-262s arrived like promises from the future. Their speed flattened distance. Their climb mocked the old prop-driven geometry. But speed is not a plan. It is an ingredient. Jets that entered too hot could not turn their energy into a killing pass before the target moved and angles closed. A few found themselves forced into shallow merges, where Mustangs already pointed the right way turned speed into a liability. Short bursts at the moment a jet's path and pride crossed. Others returned to base with tanks scoured of their last fumes, the sprint having outrun the war it was meant to win. On the ground, maintenance chiefs counted bullet holes and brought numbers to briefings that had once been about stories. Bombers home. Escorts intact. Fewer heavies missing than the pattern predicted. The numbers said what pride would not. The window had closed. That precious, murderous interval when escorts vanished and hunters feasted was shrinking into a slit of time too small for certainty. Intercepts still hurt. Men still died. No one pretended otherwise. But the defense was no longer hunting. It was surviving. In mess halls and dispersals, the jokes about red tails curdled into quieter questions. Who are these men who do not chase? How do they still have fuel when the second pass should belong to us? Why does their formation never seem to fray, where our doctrine expects it to? Veteran hands tapped cigarettes into tin cups and stared at maps that had stopped behaving. Range, once dismissed as a fairy trick, had become a blade held at the right minute. Discipline, once mocked as timidity, had become an ambush for the ambusher. The realization did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as a mood. Controllers spoke more softly. Squadron leaders found themselves assigning cautions that sounded smaller than the problem. Watch the beam escorts are thick there. Do not overrun the pass. Fuel, mind your fuel. The future they had counted on the jet in numbers, the miracle that restores timing, was late, and the present had decided to lean against it. Above them, contrails held like handwriting that refused to smudge. When the last bomber turned and the escorts turned with them, still tight, still there, a silence leaked into the headsets. You cannot fight a clock that will not give you the minutes you've built your courage on. That was the cruel, simple truth rising from the day's smoke. The enemy had turned minutes into a weapon, and minutes were how wars of industry are won. Range turned from a performance number into a strategy. When the escorts stopped vanishing in the last 10 minutes, the shape of the European air war bent toward inevitability. The Luftwaffe's defense and art of timed ambushes depended on windows, a sag in the escort line, a moment when fuel clocks forced Mustangs to drift home, and bomber boxes crossed the heart of the Reich alone. Close those windows, and the defender trades hunting for surviving. That is what the Red Tail's way of flying. Range made routine discipline, made reflex, did to the whole front. You could measure it in factories that did not wake the next morning. Oil plants coking, works marshalling yards. The targets the bomber barons had always promised to crack were finally cracked, not because bombs suddenly grew clever, but because the minutes over target were protected. Deep escort made daylight precision something more than a theory. It kept lead crews steady through the IP, kept tight boxes from blooming into stragglers, and denied German fighters their second pass, the one that usually killed. With those passes erased, the campaign's arithmetic began to compound. Compounding changed more than bomb damage assessment. It changed tempo. Air commanders no longer had to schedule around a fragile edge. They could plan raids that leaned on predictability, strikes that returned again and again to the same arteries, until a nation's circulation gave out. Rail hubs became ruins that could not be tidied up between visits. Refineries lost not just distillation columns, but rhythm outages collided with shortages. Repair crews chased parts they could not find. Dispersal fields received dribbles of fuel where gushers were needed. Aerial warfare, once driven by moments, slid into a battle of minutes accumulated across a calendar. That is how an air arm dehydrates. The Luftwaffe felt the strategic turn first in training. Experienced leaders were dying, not spectacularly, but steadily. Replacements arrived with fewer hours and thinner judgment. Each lost window forced more frantic scrambles and longer climbs from farther fields. The jet, sleek, astonishing, arrived into a sky that no longer granted it the time to matter. Where escorts held and ambushes shortened, speed became a tax on fuel, not a license to kill. The prop-driven hunters, thinking in geometry instead of awe, made the future overshoot the present. On the ground, armies advancing from west and east discovered that air made new promises. Bridges did not reappear. Railheads did not recover their timing. The Luftwaffe could still strike, but it could not sustain. And when you cannot sustain, you leak power into the dirt. Convoys delayed. Divisions starved for ammunition. Retreats that jam themselves on roads the enemy already has a plan to bomb. The Red Tails were one group in a vast machine, no myth here, no single savior, but their way of escorting unlocked the only definition of victory that matters in a strategic air campaign: the ability to choose when and how often to hit what runs a modern war. Industry at home made it possible. Doctrine in the cockpit made it real. The net effect was to move the war's fulcrum from courage to certainty, to lift the burden from a handful of hero sorties onto a system that could show up on a gray Tuesday, and again on Thursday, and again on Saturday, until the geometry of an empire's defense no longer added up. When contrails hold, policy becomes physics, and physics, once it tips, does not argue. After the war, men who had once bet their lives on seconds tried to name what had beaten them. Some reached for the romance of better aces or smarter tricks. Others looked at the ledger. Albert Speer, writing from the wreckage of the ministry he had tried to harden, conceded the simple arithmetic the air war imposed. In the end, it was production that decided the war. Factories, he meant not the blueprints alone, but the rivers of parts and fuel that flowed because the sky could no longer be kept clear. The long-range escorts did not drop the bombs. They guaranteed the minutes in which bombs could matter. Adolf Galland, the fighter general who had measured pilots by nerve and timing, is widely quoted as saying that the day he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Whether those are his precise words or the sharpened memory of a defeated air arm, scarcely changes the truth inside them once the Americans could reach the capital and stay long enough to deny the second pass. The Luftwaffe's craft could no longer rescue strategy. Other officers said the same thing without epigrams. They spoke of fuel that never arrived, of jets that returned empty because the second merge never materialized, of a calendar filled with raids that could not be postponed by weather and hope. You hear resignation in those recollections, but also a kind of professional respect for a system that turned restraint into a weapon and endurance into a blade. The red paint on those tales was only a mark. The message was everything behind it, industry at scale logistics that did not blink doctrine that refused to chase pilots who measured valor by how many engines rolled back over friendly concrete at dusk. In the end, even the enemy learned to read that message.